Welcome to the Wilsonville Public Library Genealogy Club. Today's topic, Help, My Family's Lost in the 1890s, working around the loss of the 1890 census. My name is Malia. I'm a librarian at the Wilsonville Public Library. I've been doing genealogy for about 31 years. As most of us know, the 1890 census was lost in a fire. All the data was destroyed, and we have a huge gap in our search for our ancestors. However, the story is actually a little more complicated than that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that history today, as well as introduce you to some records that might help fill in the gap that is left by the 1890 census. First, the history. The 1890 census is the 11th census of the United States. It was administered by the Department of Interior because a permanent census bureau had not been established yet. In fact, it would be established in 1902. The census was also kind of a census of firsts. Quite a few things were going to be newly tried during this census year, and there were a few things that they changed from previous census years, such as the enumerators. In previous years, the census takers were either the U.S. Marshals or trained individuals who actually had taken an exam in order to become a census taker, which happened in the 1880s. However, for the 1890 census, 47,000 enumerators were actually appointed to the position. These were political patronage appointments. So in other words, they were given this job as a reward or a favor for political support. And because they were appointments, no examination was required. So I'm not sure how much training they had or how much reliability there was in their information. Another thing that was interesting about the 1890 census is that this was one of the first times they decided to send out a family schedule to each of the families to fill out about their own information. So you would have everyone in one family group listed on this one schedule, and then a couple weeks later the census takers would come, collect this information, and take it to Washington, D.C. On these schedules, they also decided to expand some information based on different categories. So, like, for example, in race, they added more options to choose from besides white, black, mulatto. They actually started putting in Japanese or Chinese. They also asked more questions about home ownership, ability to speak English, their immigration and naturalization, and also if they were a Civil War veteran. If there was a Civil War veteran in the family group, then the census taker would provide them with another sheet of paper, which was the 1890 veteran schedule. And this would provide information about their service during the Civil War. Why did they give out a family schedule to the families? Well, they were trying to do it similar to the United Kingdom. And the hope was this would make tabulating the information a little bit faster. Because instead of having an individual census taker to be at each home filling out the information, if it was already done, all they had to do was collect a piece of paper. And their concern was around the fact that in the 1880s, the census took 8 years to tabulate all that information by hand. And the policymakers feared that because the population had exploded, that when it came to the 1890 census, it was going to take them 13 years to tabulate this information, which would then delay the reappointments of congressional districts, and they wouldn't be ready in time for the 1900s. However, in reality, it actually took less time to tabulate this information from the 1890 census. Because some of this information was sent out ahead of time, the enumerators were actually able to collect all the information and find the people who were missing or didn't fill out the form. And they got their data collection done by July 1st. So essentially 1 month for them to gather all this information. And then when it came to the tabulation, they actually finished 2 years early compared to the 1880 census. So they finished in 6 years, and they were also under budget. And most of this had to do with one very special machine. It was the Herman Hollerith electric tabulation machine. This was the very first time it was used, and it was actually created to do the tabulation on the 1890 census. Part of this reason is because Herman Hollerith was a census employee, and he felt there had to be a way to mechanize the data collection. So what he created was a punch card system. On the left, you'll see is the punch card that they used, and what they would do is punch holes for the data, and each card represented one person. So if it was male, they would punch in one spot. If it was female, they would punch in another. And all the information that was on these family schedules would be punched into this card. Once the holes were punched, they would then place this card onto the device on the right side of your screen. And they had a metal plate. When they placed the card on the plate and put the lid down, there were pins that would drop down. And these pins would fall through the holes, and wherever there was a hole, the metal pin would hit the plate and create an electrical charge, which would then send a data signal to the dials in the back of the machine, and it would tabulate the information. What was nice about having this machine to do this was not only did it allow them to tabulate their information quicker, but it also allowed them to look at specific data points. So they could identify how many Chinese people lived in California and what ages they were. Herman Hollerith became rather popular with this machine, and he found ways to improve it throughout the ages. And eventually, he decided to change the name of his company. And in 1924, his company became known as IBM. But along with everything that happened in the 1890s with the census, one of the things that readily popped up after it was completed and some preliminary results were revealed was accusations of fraud. People were accused of adding phony names to the census, or that groups of people were not counted for whatever reason. In one case in Baltimore, the police decided to do their own census, and they ended up finding close to 21,000 people that were not counted in the federal census. In Minnesota, the St. Paul businessmen accused the Minneapolis businessmen of adding more than 1,100 names to the census to make it look like Minneapolis had more people living there than St. Paul did. In fact, that situation kind of took over the newspapers because it actually went to court. The St. Paul businessmen started suing Minneapolis businessmen. And when the newspapers reported on it, you could kind of tell which newspaper was from where. For example, the one titled "Outrageous, a Dastardly Piece of Legal Vandalism" came from a Minneapolis newspaper. And "Arrested, Minneapolis Census enumerators charged with padding the returns come to grief" was actually from a St. Paul newspaper. The first tragedy that happens to the 1890 census is one that we've heard about before. It was in March of 1896 when a fire damaged some of the special schedules. These were non-population schedules, but they covered mortality, insurance, crime, the defective, delinquent, or dependent classes. Although they were limited in their scope, they still had some great information for genealogists. But at the time, the government wasn't concerned about what the genealogists want. So the Department of Interior decided, why not just destroy the rest of them, since it was damaged and they weren't going to get the statistics they needed from those. When it came to the population census, it was deemed that they were in fairly good condition. However, in January of 1921, there was a fire in the basement of the Commerce Building. And this is the big fire that we've heard all about that destroyed tons of records and kind of causes the heartache and frustration of every genealogist out there. In this case, the 1890 census were stacked on pine wood shelves outside of a fireproof vault. There's no idea why these records weren't inside the fireproof vault with the other census years. Maybe there wasn't enough room, whatever reason, but they were just outside. And on the night of January 10th, smoke appeared along the pipes of the boiler. And because the watchmen couldn't find the source, they just thought, well, maybe it was nothing. But eventually the smoke got so bad that they finally called the fire department. And it turned out that there was a boiler fire. And the boiler happened to be in the room next to the file room, which is where all the 1890 census were, along with other records. In order to put out the fire, the firemen had tried to drill holes into the floor of the building and just flooded it with water in order to put out the fire that they couldn't find, really. And then eventually, once they got it out, they went down there to make sure they got all of the fire out. And the 1890 census was actually in the path of the firemen, because firemen were not concerned about the records. They were concerned about the safety of the building, that they became collateral damage. Out of all the 1890 census documents, about 25 of them were just completely destroyed and turned to ash. Of what remained, about 50% of those were damaged by the water, the smoke, and the fire. And because at that time, they didn't really know good practices for recovery of damaged items by water and smoke, a lot of these records just sat for 3 or 4 days and became moldy and unreadable. And the belief was it was going to take months, if not years, for them to recopy out what did survive. And so it was decided that everything would just be kind of destroyed. And this came to 1932, when what had been saved or hadn't been damaged was now going to be destroyed as well. Because in December of 1932, the government goes through a retention policy where they're transferring records that are no longer needed for current business and could be either saved for historical value or destroyed. The Census Bureau chief creates a list of documents that he doesn't believe are needed anymore, and he gives it to the Librarian of Congress to make sure that there's nothing on this list that should be retained for historical value. Item 22 on this list happened to be the 1890 census. We're not sure exactly what happened, why the Librarian of Congress approves this list without making changes. It could be that maybe because they were just so badly damaged and not complete that they just decided to destroy everything. Or maybe the librarian didn't happen to see that on the list. Not really sure. But on February 21st of 1933, Congress authorized the destructions of the records per their retention policy. And by 1935, the 1890 census is fully destroyed. End of story. Well, not quite. There's a twist. Like all good stories, not everything was actually lost. In 1942, the Census Bureau had been given new offices and they were moving to Maryland. So as they were cleaning out their office, they came across a bundle of fragments from the Illinois area. And so for quite a few years, we thought that was the only fragments that had survived. But in 1953, the National Archives were ascensioning records into their collections, and they received quite a few more fragments from 10 other states, including Washington, D.C. Which means not everything of the 1890 census was lost, and there is a possibility that maybe one of our ancestors is listed on these schedules. All you can do is look and find out. To give you an idea of how much was lost and how much survived, we know that there was almost 63 million people who were enumerated. Of the fragments that survived, we have 6,160 names, which is about 1,233 pieces of paper. So on the bright side, it's not many pieces of paper to browse through, but on the downside, really, it's less than 1% of the people that could have been on these schedules survived. So, like I said, if you're lucky enough to have your ancestors in these fragments, I'm extremely jealous of you. To check to see if your family is in these census fragments, what you can do is go onto Family Search or Ancestry, or even the Library Edition of Ancestry, or MyHeritage, and search their database. You can either do it through a search engine, or you can browse each of the fragments individually. And I do recommend checking it out, because you never know, you might find your family, but then again, you might find neighbors that survived, or maybe it's just interesting to see what's listed there, and might give you some ideas of what you could search for, especially if it was a Civil War ancestor. For those of us who aren't lucky enough to have our information in the census fragments, there are other ways that we can find some information to fill in those gaps. And so we have different paths we can take, and I will discuss all of these coming up. So we'll have the 1890 census for veterans. We'll have the state census, city directories, tax and voter lists, and newspapers. For the 1890 veteran schedule, or also known as the 1890 veteran census, this came about because the Pensions Office wanted to create a easy-to-read book or listing of all the veterans who might be applying for pensions or had already applied for pensions, and also have a record of any of their widows who could be receiving these pensions. The schedule was geared towards the Union soldiers. However, there are some soldiers from the Confederate Army, as well as the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, that happened to be enumerated during this schedule. And the information that you would find on there will be the name of the veteran, their service information, their rank, and maybe even some little stories about them, or maybe scars, something fun. But it also will let you know where their post office was, so it'll give you an idea of where they were living, which is great. If you're able to find your ancestor in here, you'll have an idea where the family could have been living at the time, especially if it was part of the destroyed 1890 population census. On the downside, some of these schedules did get destroyed. It's believed they were destroyed by the fire, but there's no proof that it was the 1921 fire or even the 1896 fire. There are fragments from all the states, and for the most part of Kentucky until the end of the alphabet, quite a few of those survived. So again, definitely worth checking out and seeing if your ancestors are listed in there. But if that's not going to help you, this one might. So we have state censuses. A lot of these occurred on the fives in between the federal census. And so an 1885 or an 1895 census might provide you with some information on your family that could have been lost in the 1890 census. However, some states didn't actually do it on those years. Some of them would do it in like 1892. I've even seen an 1898 census. So the ideal way of looking for this information is look at the state level and see if you can find a census during that time period that you need. State archives, state libraries, historical societies, all of them would hopefully have some type of information on the state census. There's also a possibility that it has already been microfilmed, and you might be able to find it in Family Search or one of the other popular genealogy databases, Ancestry, MyHeritage. Now, the most useful records that we can find to fill in that gap from the 1890 census are actually city and farm directories. These are similar to the white pages, and what they would do is list the names of the citizens that were living there, especially if they were all adults, and give you some information about them, like their address or maybe where they were employed. And in some cases, for example, the Burlington, Vermont City Directory for 1892, I have my second great-grandfather, Edwin H. Trick, and it says that he died on November 11th, 1891. So it gives me a little bit of death information. It also lists his widow and then some of his children that were living in the house, the same house as she was. Now, not all of Edwin's children are listed in here, and so it's a couple possibilities. One, some of the kids could have married already, or in another case, they were in school, and so they didn't have a job, so they weren't listed as being employed or anything else. So you might not get everyone on a city directory, but you'll get enough information to help you find some more clues. The other thing to do is make sure to look beyond just the name of the people listed in the directory, because you might also find maps in there that not only will allow you to figure out where your ancestors lived, but they also might show the general area that the directory is representing, and maybe borders change, especially if it's like a county directory. And there could also be a history that's listed in there that will let you know when the town was incorporated, where else you might want to look for information on your ancestors. Maybe it's a different county or maybe a different city. And then finally, all good city directories also list businesses, churches, cemeteries, schools, other little details like that, fraternity societies, things that your family would have been interested in. So that would not only lead you to more details about their life, but also might have records that could fill in your gaps. The next lists that I would recommend checking out are voters list. So in order to vote, they had to all register, had to prove that they were citizens. And so a lot of these voter lists, especially from the 1890s, have survived, and you might find some details about your ancestors. In the case of Mendocino County in 1896, I can see the list of people's names, their height, weight, other physical characteristics, including any visible marks or scars that they might have had. It also lets me know about their occupations, where they were born, and if they were born outside the U.S., for example, there's a Nova Scotia man on here, it lets me know when they were naturalized. And in his case, he was naturalized in 1886. So if that was my ancestor, I would be able to search for a naturalization record around that time period. Also gives a date of registration, and on this list, most of these men were registered in 1891 or 1892, which will at least let me know that they at least lived in Mendocino County for at least 4 to 5 years in order to be on this voters list. Another list to check out are tax lists. So most people who own property were taxed on that property. And it could be their house, it could be their livestock. If they had slaves, they would have been taxed on that property. So you definitely want to check out these lists just to see if your ancestors are there, to at least give you an idea of where they were living at the time they were taxed. The other thing is even though it mostly lists people's names, you can gather a few ideas from these lists, such as, depending on the state, if the person was 16 or 18, they would have started paying taxes around that time. So you might get some of those younger generations listed. The other thing is they would usually be taxed until they were called as aged out. When they roughly became 50 or 60 years old, they no longer had to pay taxes. And so they weren't on these lists. So by searching for your family on there, you might be able to determine a large age range, but if you don't find them on there, it might give you some clues that either they aged out of being on the taxes or maybe they passed away. Another type of tax list that's on Ancestry is actually the employment records for the Internal Revenue Service. I believe these are actually also on Family Search too. And what this is employment records for all the tax agents for various areas. And it would give you information about when they were appointed as a tax agent, but also where and when they were born and the time of their service and how they ended their service. So definitely worth checking out. The next records that I highly recommend checking out are newspapers. Now, you're probably thinking, oh yeah, I know all about newspapers. But the mistake that we make usually is we always look at just the birth, marriage, and death. We don't look beyond those categories. I really encourage you to look beyond those categories. You never know what you're going to find. You might find an article that talks about your ancestor that you would never have thought to look for. It could be that maybe it's as simple as they're graduating from high school and they listed all the graduates. Or maybe they were a criminal and there's a court case about them. So you want to read those news articles. Other times you might find information in like a social or a society column. In one case, I was helping one of my friends search for their ancestor, and in a gossip column, it mentioned how her ancestor and 3 of his friends all went to the neighboring county and bet on the horses. So, the other thing is look at those advertisements and classifieds, because it could be that maybe your ancestor owned a business and they put in an ad for their company, or maybe they were selling something. I've found homes for sale or foreclosures that were related to my family members. And most importantly, I also check out the shipping news, mostly because my New England ancestors were all mariners. They either owned boats, captained them, or were just sailors on a boat. And so I can either follow the passage of these ships, or in one case, it actually helped me solve my brick wall. Or my 5th great-grandfather, I didn't know when he died and couldn't find any information on him. And I started searching about the ship that he was a sailor on. And at one point in the shipping news, another ship mentioned that they had seen this ship and that 3 of their crewmen had gotten sick and they were heading to quarantine. With a little more research and knowing roughly when to narrow down my search, I was eventually able to find a record about the ship, and they list the names of the crew members who were ill, and my ancestor's name was mentioned in them, although it was severely misspelled. But there was enough clues for me to be pretty positive that it was my ancestor. Definitely look at those newspapers, and if you have to, browse them, especially if it's one of the local papers of your area. You never know what you'll find. The next source that I recommend is called the Periodical Source Index, also known as PERSI. This database used to be available on a variety of different genealogy websites. However, for some reason, they were removed from those sites, and the only site that I've been able to find it on now is Find My Past, which is also a subscription database. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes it's just too much to buy every single database that I find. So the nice thing about this one is it's actually free to search. So I can actually go to the Find My Past website, I can enter in some information, and I can see what would pop up. The only time it asks me to pay is if I click on one of the icons where I can either see a transcription of the article or maybe an image of the article. But in order to work beyond that, what I can do is put in the names and see what comes up, and then see if I can find another way of finding these publications that are from historical, genealogical, or ethnic groups. In this case, I did a search on John Bent, and I came across, actually I did it on the Bent family, so I got more than just John Bent. But the very first one that popped up for me was a John Bent in Sudbury, Massachusetts, which I knew was my ancestor. And it was in a periodical called the New England Historical and Genealogical Register. And the year was 1895. Now, since I didn't want to pay for Find My Past, I knew I could search for this periodical on its own. And because one of the databases that I personally own is actually the New England Ancestors, which puts out this register, I was actually able to go into that database, search through it, and find the article without having to pay extra. In other cases, when I'm not too sure if it's what article it is or what newspaper it's in, I might Google it. So, for example, with the Samuel Bent obituary from 1912, it's in the Bostonian Society Proceedings. And again, I don't know if that's a newspaper or if it was a newsletter for a historical society. So what I would do is I would Google that and see if I can figure out how it's related, and then also find out if there's another place that has this information for me, that maybe I could write to a public library that might have a copy of it and ask if they can photocopy out that article for me. Sometimes also you might find out that they're in a historical society collection. So, example, the last one on here with the Bent family in Massachusetts, Ohio, and Bent Sports in Kansas, it says the Kansas State Historical Society Collections. So in this case, what I would do is I would Google that historical society and search their library for my Bent family and see what came up. Some other records that you want to check out are the maps, especially plat maps and insurance maps. A lot of these maps are going to be similar to the one on the right, where they'll list the names of the people who own the various buildings that are shown. The other benefit to these maps is they're also going to show you where there are churches, cemeteries, schools. So you might be able to find other records that are within a walking distance of where your family lived. The other thing will be is a lot of these records might also have land deeds related to them. So you would be able to search for any land records that are out there for your ancestor. I would also check out military records. There were wars going on during that time period, so it's very possible that maybe your ancestor was in the military and they might not have been on any of the census records. My second great-grandfather was in the Philippines insurrection, and I wasn't able to find him in the 1900 census because he was out on a ship. You also want to check out any cemeteries that are in the area, because if somebody passed away who might have been born between the 1880s and the 1900s and died also during that time period, they might be only found in a cemetery. Same thing with church records. You have the birth, marriage, death, baptisms, christenings. All of these records might be able to provide some clues to any family members who might have been involved with the church during that time period. I would also look at school and business records as well. The school records would get those that might not have been listed on any of the other records I've mentioned because they weren't adults. And then business records, in the case of one of my ancestors, they owned a meat market, and when he passed away, it looks like his son took over, or his son at least followed in the same occupation. So I could look for business records related to the meat market that I knew Mr. Trick owned and see if there's any documentation saying that he gave his business to his son, George. So finally, some search tips for you. As I mentioned before, always check out the fragments and the veteran schedule, even if you don't think your ancestor's in there. You might get lucky. The other thing is by searching through it, you can eliminate it from your search queues because you've now seen what was in there and it wasn't useful for you. The other thing to do is think of other records that might be available during that time period and explore different databases. You can Google a records research checklist, and it provides you with a list of possible records that might have appeared during your ancestor's lifetime. And it might give you some ideas of other records to search for to fill in that gap for the 1890s. For the most part, it helps us keep our brains active and thinking and outside of the box of what you normally would look for. And you never know. Even if you don't happen to find your ancestor in the records you're looking for, it might help you break down a brick wall with another one of your ancestors because now you know about that type of record that exists. And I recommend exploring random databases, even if you don't think your ancestors are in there, because again, you might learn something from it, but you also might be surprised. You might actually find your ancestor. In one case, I was searching for my great-great-grandfather, and the theory was that he had been adopted by a family, but we couldn't find any records of it and didn't even know if it even had gone to the courts or not. So I was browsing. I knew he lived in New York at one point. I also knew he lived in Vermont, but he didn't live in Vermont until after the war, so later in the 1900s. But I was searching through Vermont records, and I came across guardianship papers. I really didn't think he would be in there, but I decided, what the heck, let's check, and just for the fun of it, we'll look. And because I knew that he had lived with 3 other families, I decided to look up some of those family names that were related in there. So when I did a search on my ancestor, I didn't find anything. But when it came to searching for these other family members or the families that he had lived with, I actually came across a document, and it ended up being a guardianship paper, and it was actually related to my ancestor. I don't know why it didn't show up in the search, but it ended up being guardianship papers. So when he entered into the military to fight in the Philippines insurrection, he was asking one of the families that he'd lived with if they would take care of his bills and other estate issues. So it wasn't a formal adoption, but it was a legal document that I would never have thought to look for. While you are searching these databases and stuff, 2 things you should definitely make sure to do. One of them is keep a timeline. Not only does it help you organize your information, especially chronologically, but it helps you narrow down your gaps. It gives you a way to focus on what years you want to look at. And especially if you're looking at those city directories, being able to list in there where you found them each time, that if they happen to move sometime in there, you can at least get a guess on where they could have moved at what time period. The other thing to do is keep a research log. Now, I admit I'm not very good at keeping these logs, but they are very useful. What you end up doing is you're recording the name of the database that you're searching, who and what you're searching for, and the date that you searched it. And then you can always add in other information as well. But by doing that, it helps you when you get frustrated on working on your ancestor and not finding anything, and you decide to ignore it for a few years, or 10 in my case. And when you come back, you don't want to repeat that search that you did. So by having that research log, you could start from where you left off in the database and continue on. Or maybe you'll notice that the database that you're searching in had been updated. And by knowing the last time you searched it, you can see if that update happened after that time period, and maybe you need to repeat your search. And when it does come to searching, I prefer the less is more method of searching. So instead of filling out every single box that's available in my search engine, I put in very few details. A lot of the times it might just be their name and a place, maybe a name and age. Sometimes I just do their surname and one other detail. Mostly because I want to find other ways of finding this information, especially to try to get around those transcription errors that occur. A lot of times I found it where the surname was misspelled so badly that there would have been no way that I would have found it without browsing. But by doing a first name search, a place, and an age, I was able to narrow it down to 100 people, and I found a name that looked similar enough that I had to check it out. You can always try doing a search where we put everything in there, but the key thing to remember with any search engine is it's going by keywords. And the more information you give it, the results are going to try to give you the records that have all those search terms in it, and they rank them. So it's very possible that, with the case of my ancestor whose surname was spelled wrong, he would have been at the very end of this list of names, and I might not have ever found him because I didn't go beyond page 1 or 2. So this is why I play around with the searches. Not only when I know that I'm limiting my information, it causes me to look beyond the first couple of pages of the search results and see what else is available. And when you're doing these searches, especially if you're in Ancestry, you might come across records where it says no image, it's only a text-only collection. Don't always assume that there isn't an image to go with this. It could just be that there's some agreement between the owning organization of the records and Ancestry that they're just doing a text index. And especially if you happen to see a film number listed. So in this case, it's a Family History Library film number. And because Family Search is part of the Family History Libraries, you can actually take this film number and go into Family Search and see if the record exists in there. Maybe you might be able to browse a microfilm. So what I do is pull up Family Search, go into the search feature, and instead of searching records, where I could enter in this film number and see what comes up, I actually prefer to go into the Family Search catalog. And there's a couple reasons for this. One of the reasons is that when I search it by the records category and that film number, maybe not everything's been transcribed yet or indexed, or maybe there's something else on that roll that I wouldn't have been able to find before. By going into the catalog, it will help me narrow down exactly which microfilm it is and be able to learn more information about the data that's on that record. So to do that search, once you pull up the catalog, ignore the first part where it says search by. You just leave all that information blank. You actually go down to where it says search for and click on the part that says film fiche number. Type in that number that you found on the Ancestry record. And once you do your search, it will pop up with the records. And in this case, again, it was Texas County tax rolls, which is what I remembered from my Ancestry search. And in this case, I was going to get lucky because in the notes, it lets me know that these rolls are available online, and I can click on the click here button, and it will take me either to a search page to search for them, or maybe it will bring me to all of the images of those records, and I can browse through them. However, if you don't happen to have these records online and you can't browse through them, don't leave this page. Scroll down to where you find the film and digital notes, because this is where it's going to list all of the microfilms that fall under that category of the Texas tax rolls. And it might be they're broken out based on what counties they belong to or something else. But you also might be able to find out where in the film they're located. A number of times that I've browsed images, there's thousands of images to look through, but they're broken up by items. And I might actually have to get to item number 5 to find my ancestor, whereas if I went to item number 1 and thought that I didn't find them there, that they weren't in there in the first place. The other thing that you might find on these notes is under format, you might see some icons. If you happen to see the magnifying lens, this lets you know that these records are searchable. So you would be able to hit that, search those records for your ancestor's name, and maybe something would pop up. If you see the camera icon, this lets you know that there's images that you can browse. And if you click on that, it will bring you to the page to browse, and it'd either take you directly to the images, or you might have to jump through a couple of hoops, like selecting a county and a record type in order to get to the specific images. However, in some cases, you might actually see a camera with a little key above it. What this is telling you is that these records are actually restricted, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't get access to them. A lot of the times, you have to be inside a family history center or an affiliate library. Granted, during this pandemic, a lot of these places are closed to the public and there's no way to access them. But not necessarily true. At least on Family Search, the Wilsonville Library is an affiliate library to the Family History Center. And if you are on our Wi-Fi, even though you're parked in our parking lot, you would still be able to get access to some of these records. So what you're essentially doing is convincing the website that you are on the Wi-Fi network or inside the building of the library, that it has access to this. So you'd be able to do a search that way. Might not work at all of the family history centers or affiliate libraries, but it's definitely worth a try. If that doesn't work, what I usually do is I print out of the record and I write a note, either handwritten or typed onto it, if I do a digital copy of it, saying who I was searching for. And then when I decide to go to Salt Lake City, or I'm able to get back into my libraries to do these searches, then I have that list of what I wanted to search for and why. And finally, remember that behind every obstacle is an opportunity. Every record that we find, no matter how small, helps us chip away at that brick wall. And even though the 1890 census was destroyed and a lot of the names are not in there that help us, this gives us the opportunity to learn about other records that occurred during that time period and might lead us to new resources to use. Take the time to explore, have some fun with it. If you get frustrated, put it to the side. Work on another family member. You can always come back to it later. Thank you for listening to today's presentation. Hope you have a good time researching.